Hi everyone, my name is Valentine. We're back with the community show that we've been doing a few editions now, and we took a break. It's not you. The last 2 months have been pretty busy. I was in Poland. I was actually in 7 different countries around the last 2 months, so that was a bit busy. Sorry for that, but we're back. There's more talk about tech trends. This started initially with the idea of doing one episode, and it got so bad. So we're probably gonna have to do a few more, but right now the focus of this episodes is about tech trends in terms of not short-term tech trends like what we did last time, but stuff that comes up in the next 3 years, next 5 years that organizations that do social impact should keep an eye on, because it turns out that when you make your plans for the next 5 years, you have to look at trends because they can change actually especially in terms of text, they can change the face and the shape of things to come. So I'm not. It's not just going to be me rambling for 1 hour. Rest assured, we have a fantastic duo that will be with me. First, meet Alex from Talk to Loop. Hi, Alex. You're muted. Let me just unmute that. Oh, you
Thanks
fantastic.
for
Can
having
you?
me.
A pleasure. Can you present what you do and your organization in a few words?
Yeah, sure. I'm the founder of Talk to Loop, a charity that focuses, a sole purpose is to allow people who receive humanitarian or development aid to feed back on it in an open, transparent way and to report abuse if needed anonymously and safely.
Fantastic, really important and a good use of technology. We like that, so we definitely curious to see what are your thoughts about what we should keep an eye on. And we also have Paul. Hi, Paul.
Hi there. Thanks for inviting me, Valentine. Nice to meet everyone. Ray, I'm a computer scientist by background and a technologist. I've spent probably 23 years now working in the technology field. Before the last 8 years, I spent 7 years in Kenya, running a social enterprise and utilizing best of breed technologies, to try and improve social impact in a variety of areas. I also have a dual hat on now, running an organization in the UK called 3 Life Prints, where we make 3 printed medical devices, personalized for surgery, but still with a big focus humanitarian, working with the United Nations and the Red Cross in multiple post-conflict and conflict zones.
Fantastic. So let's get started. There's a lot of potential topics. Which one should we start first? So basically, when you're doing your planning, what is for you, Alex or Paul, kind of top of mind of things that you should probably keep an eye on because that will change your plan or you have to account for it?
Accessibility. To me, with everything that we're doing and with everything that we're working on, it's about making sure that the people who need to can get access to the service. So it's not about the technology, it's about access to what it is that they need to help with their situation, with the crisis that they're facing, and with climate change and things like that. This is only going to increase and affect more people. So just making sure that people have access to the technology to get the services that they need. So whether that be different languages, offline, different input channels and mechanisms, speech to text, all of these types of things.
Yeah, I
So,
find it. Sorry, I find it very, very interesting, Alex, that you said. Probably for me, it's about sustainability. I'm very, as a technologist, very technology agnostic. The technology comes and goes, and especially within developing world situations, it's moving very fast. And for me, it's about choosing the appropriate technology at the appropriate time, but understanding how do you keep that technology framework in place in 3 years' time, and in 5 years' time. So I think that kind of quite nicely complements what you mentioned about accessibility, affordability, sustainability, etc.
Yeah.
and it makes sense also with this idea. It's a fantastic way to start a conversation. It makes sense with the idea of a general maturity over the whole conversation about technology, right? It's great to be excited. Everybody's familiar with this kind of hype loop. At first, you get excited by technology, and then you don't hear much about it. And then I think in so many fields, it gets back with a more mature perspective of saying, okay, besides the tech component that we're not excited about anymore, how can we make sure that everybody is using it? So let's say break it down in a few pieces. You talked about a few ways to make those technology accessible. So if we design, or if as a nonprofit or a social impact organization, we use or we plan to use technologies, and we want to make sure that they're accessible. what are the things that we should incorporate in our decision-making process and how we choose those technologies, so we don't find ourselves in 3 years saying, oh, well, that's it, that technology crashed, we were dependent on some sort of servers or etc. So what are the traps to avoid?
I think the way to avoid traps is to talk to those people, to talk to the people that you're trying to make sure you don't leave out. So the people who maybe don't have a smartphone, the people who are in rural communities where the connection is on and off, where they can't always charge their phone, and they will have the answers. They have incredible and often very different ways of getting around issues and finding solutions that help them to do that, and that piggyback off solutions that they're already using to access other services. And I don't think that sitting in wherever we're all sitting, we have the answers to those things, because it's not an everyday challenge for us. And so really user-led design, having local tech companies involved in helping with that process, in exploring what's being used locally by different types of groups. What we're learning in Loop is that in different countries, people are adapting existing technology for different purposes, and that looks very different in every country. So how can we adapt Loop to make sure that we fit within that, and piggyback off what people are already finding successful? So it's not always about technology.
But no, it's true, because you keep an eye on how people are already using those technologies, because you might be surprised. One conversation often goes in terms of mobile payments. Here we start to use it a bit more, but some countries, because inflation or the value of the currency fluctuates too much, started using mobile payments 10 years ago, right? And for us here, it's fairly new in the scope of things.
It is, Valentine. And I think, I did an experiment in Kenya where I lived for 7 years, where I spent 9 months and I didn't use cash for 9 months. I used my phone only for 9 months with M-Pesa. So Kenya is definitely one of the poster examples globally. 42 million users use M-Pesa. You can buy your newspaper, you can buy your breakfast, you can buy a beer, all these sort of things. And so literally for 9 months, I had no money at all in me. I just used my phone.
And I'm curious, for that specific instance, what's the kind of user experience? Because if you want everybody to be able to use something as core as a way to exchange, products or services, that technology, that tool has to be extremely simple and accessible, right? So how's the experience when you use it?
Absolutely. And so, from my background, UX design as well, and from UI design, it's towards how do you make it simple with USSD, for example. People don't have smartphones. There's still, 1980s of Nokia phones, etc. And really, towards how do you make it as cheap as possible for me to transfer money to Alex, for example. I want to send her 1,000 shillings. How can I minimize the commission towards that? It's instantaneous. My previous life, I worked for Opportunity International, which is a microfinance global organization. So how can a farmer send money to buy chemicals? How can a farmer send money to buy fertilizer, etc.? And literally, the Western world has been very slow to adopt that. They've tried to put more bells and whistles on it, but at the end of the day, there's also a security aspect. So if you're carrying cash around in a country where perhaps the security isn't as great, there's a risk towards that. And really, for me, it was actually quite a liberating experience to not have a wallet, to not have bank cards, to not have anything but my phone. Obviously, your phone is your wallet. If your phone runs out of battery, then you're in trouble, etc. But it also brings up the local staffing. So there are probably 25 to 50,000 kiosks in Kenya, where there's jobs for locals, where they provide cashing out services for M-Pesa, Tigo. In my previous job, we worked in probably about 19 countries in Africa, covering everything from East Africa to Congo, etc. And really, I was blown away by how the adoption of mobile money, not just from a day-to-day perspective, but from a business perspective. You go to the pub, you go to a restaurant, you're trying to sell wheat, etc. They made it so simple and so easy to be able to transfer money.
So tell me more about that simple and easy. Let's say you're in the farmer's market, and you wanna buy a product.
Yeah.
how do I go about making that transaction? Let's
So I
say
think
I don't even have the app. Like, walk me through those steps for
so.
those who never used
It
that.
all comes back to the telcos. So Safaricom, Vodacom, etc. Across Southeast Asia as well. So
So
basically,
there's
towards
cell phone companies, basically. Yeah.
yeah, the telcos are the ones. So in Kenya, there was a funny situation that happened where all of a sudden the telcos became banks. So imagine Barclays Banks or Standard Chartered became a bank. Sorry, became a telco. Imagine BT became a bank. So all of a sudden they had a lot of money under their. They were not regulated,
Mm.
and a lot of fraud happened. But all of a sudden, the crossover between a bank and a telco became quite grey, to the point though. So let's say I don't know, $1,000 within my mobile money system. If I lose my phone, I've lost it.
Mm.
There's obviously a risk towards that. But really, the simplicity towards the system
You,
is
you
not.
mean the phone, the physical phone, or you mean the phone number itself?
Yeah, so the phone number is everything. So in Europe or in America, it's a zip code or a postcode that identifies you or
Yeah.
driving license. In developing countries, it's your phone number. Your phone number is the key towards your soul in some ways. And so you can carry money across from wallet to wallet. But let's say, for example, I wanted to buy 100 solar panels. I could easily get the phone number of the person that I want to buy it from,
Hmm.
uh, log on to my simple non-smartphone USSD system, so hash
Like a little
122.
Nokia, for example.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly. And then option one, option five, send money, confirmation, finished. SMS, etc. And a lot of the telcos actually gave incentives towards that because people who have low means towards finances, they pay for messages, they pay for data, and so all of a sudden the telcos started to incentivize people because they would not be charged. So to use the system and send money, there was no charge towards that. To send an SMS, to do a WhatsApp, etc. So really, they were quite smart in how they developed the system
Mhm.
towards not just uh, providing the ability to send money seamlessly, but also to make it affordable. I live in Spain just now, and for me, I would love to have the same system where I could go to the petrol station or I go to the shop and I could just send two or three codes and finished.
Yeah. So to just a bit give context for viewers who are not familiar with that system, what it looks like is, imagine when you call a phone number and they give you the list of options, right? That you have to listen through. Right now, imagine is instead that list of option, it takes a shape a bit of almost like a text interface, right? That you can basically have that list sent to you in a text format, and then you can just select one, two, three. So basically, directs you directly to the option you want, and people use that to recharge the card, to inquire about specific information, and in that case, essentially send money. So almost like the easiest app that can work on anything, and it's not NFC, it's not anything complicated. Is I need a phone number, I need another phone number, and I need to specify what amount of currency I'm sending. And in some countries, by the way, it's minutes. That's the weird thing, as Paul said, in terms of when money fluctuates and when those markets are not regulated. What suddenly happened is that Orange, for example, which is a big carrier, for those who don't know, it's like the Rogers here in Canada. Basically, people when they're on prepaid, which a lot of people are using prepaid, start sending minutes, because minutes has an equivalent of, let's say, for $20 you can buy X amount of minutes. So people start sending minutes to one another. Almost uncanny if you consider, there was this movie called Timeless, I think, where people
Yes.
would exchange time as a
Yeah.
currency. And when you
Uh,
think about it, that's probably as good as we have in terms of stable way of metrics.
I mean,
But
it definitely
essentially,
does
was
exist. Yeah.
creating a system.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, within developing countries, an interesting development from Chinese phones was the ability to have 2 to 4 SIM cards in your phone.
Mm.
Hmm.
So you could have a SIM card for data, a SIM card for minutes, for local, etc. And really, it's quite an eye opener to see the ability to have different SIM cards because they're pretty smart, to understand how to maximize the value of
Yeah.
your SIM card. How to buy things, how to get free talk time, how to get free data, etc. And a lot of the incentivizations from NGOs and from other organizations towards, if you fill my survey in to try and help understand the situation, I'll give you 10 minutes of talk time.
Mm.
So it's a very powerful tool, because in Africa, I always sort of said that Africa leapfrogged the landline generation and went straight to cell phones. And similarly, as we'll get onto a bit later on about additive manufacturing, Africa has and will leapfrog traditional manufacturing towards additive manufacturing. But perhaps a topic for later.
Alex,
Yeah,
go ahead.
for me, I just wanted to add about those SIM cards. Sometimes with a cash distribution, you're given a certain SIM card that then is linked directly to that NGO, for example, that is, and you can continue to get the next round, but you already have a phone, you already have that number, which we've mentioned before is so important. And so this idea of the Chinese phones now having so many different SIM options, you don't have to, in a dusty place, take it out, change your SIM card over, do the different transactions. So it's really about creating this technology that provides a purpose for how technology is used in underserved places. Also, when we're working in Zambia, we'll see that some telecoms are very well covered in certain areas, but not at all in other areas, or they operate in one of the 7 Zambian languages, but not in the others. And so they use, if they're traveling around, if they're at their home village, they'll use one SIM card, and if they're in another area in Lusaka, for example, they use the other one where it's cheaper and there's much better service as well. And yeah, that's just another example. I think if we're looking longer term where things are going, I think these lower cost smartphones, which enables the use of voice, so to allow illiterate populations to start getting onto the digital technology, and then benefiting off machine translation and natural language processing and some of the tools like text-to-speech and speech-to-text. This will bring on a whole new raft of people who haven't had the opportunity to go to school, who maybe don't come from an oral language, don't feel confident typing in. And I think that that's just going to be a massive hurdle if we start to see access through them. Starlink and satellites and grey box and other things like that will get, millions and a billion people online, and they're all potential clients, potential. Yeah.
It's a great example on so when I was in Poland, I wanted to have a backup phone, and I bought one of those Nokia 6100 6100. Yeah, true, it was that model. And essentially they rebuilt an iconic phone, but they've done it. It's not Android, it's not iOS or anything, it's KaiOS. It's kind of an evolution of the old operating system you might see in Symbian on the phones, but it does include Google Assistant. So when I'm using sending a message, for example, not even WhatsApp or something like that, just sending a message, I can hold the button a few seconds and say what I have to say, and it will translate and do a pretty reasonable job. Definitely better than trying to smash those numbers, like when you press T9, when you have to press multiple times. So those technology got good and very accessible. And to give an idea, they're about, let's say, 50 US for that phone new, and you see them on the market flooded, reused. And I think the difference here, I like the fact we talk about those telecoms, is because in North America, the market is absolutely dominated in Canada by 3 carriers and in US by about 3 carriers. And they completely dominate the landscape, meaning that you cannot have a free market of phones. So all those Asian phones that are incredibly inexpensive do not exist. So essentially a mid-tier phone, a mid-range phone is about $500. Where in the rest of the world, let's say 450 US, let's say that's a kind of add or subtract 100 US, that's a mid-range phone, where in the rest of the world, you can go in with some Asian brands that will give you fairly high-end specs. So
I think
first of all,
Valentina, my phone costs $100 from China.
Exactly.
And I'm a technologist, and it does the job. I think you're alluding to is that the carriers have a monopoly in the US and Canada towards locking your phones. Similar to Africa and developing countries, the telcos have a monopoly towards the thing. In Ethiopia, the government owns Ethicom. They own the telcos, so they can monitor, they can turn off the phones, etc. My brother lived in Myanmar for 10 years and left after the recent coup, and it gives the government the control to turn off the networks, should they so wish to.
So the carrier control of carrier is one thing, and it comes with 2 consequences. When companies, let's say North America, make their strategies, they often forget that not only everybody has a phone, and not an iPhone, it's probably an Android phone. and they're getting better by the day. And that means that even very accessible phones at less than 100 US are getting really, really good with those new conditions. And I've seen that very often. People are like, oh, yeah, but how will they connect to internet? They don't have a phone. It's like, you'll be surprised by the phone they have, because that phone is their computer. That's their one investment they make within the resources they have. And most people have more than one phone. That
I think
also people forget.
just to add there, Facebook provided free Facebook towards
Mm.
non-smartphones, Nokia, WhatsApp, etc. The average person that's living in a rural setting or living in a lower socioeconomic means within a developing country, they don't browse the internet,
No,
Valentine. They
it's the
don't.
Facebook. Yeah,
It's the Facebook, it's the
Yep.
WhatsApp, it's the
yeah.
texting their friends, etc. They have particularly no interest towards that. They've been something maybe fed
Mhm.
news towards that, and so really, I actually in Africa I had a Nokia phone in my car because it's a solid phone that has 3 months of battery. It doesn't need charging,
It's safe.
and therefore it's my safety mechanism towards anything bad happen towards this.
Mhm.
I know it's always there. We often see villagers within these locations who may climb the tree, for example, to get a
Mhm.
signal. There's a sort
Yep.
of an industry that sort of happened around that. There's a man in the village that has the only charging station, for example, and all of a
Yeah.
sudden it sort of bears out this
It's a
wonderful.
revenue opportunities in rural areas, right? If you can produce electricity, suddenly people will give you a bit of money to be able to charge their device, because there's no electricity, but there's reception, right? So it's
I
an
mean,
interesting setup.
there is. I mean, I was always shocked by Kenya, Uganda, Mozambique, where 40 to 50% of the population have no access to power. It is actually that kind of sort of figures. You
Mhm.
think it's maybe not true or not, but people who will live their entire life who will never have seen a light.
Mhm.
They'll never had access within their homestead towards a power charging station.
But I think that what we're saying here is that there are almost two different digital lives. So you can have the fancy 5G, everything's on the internet, you expect people to be operating on a laptop and a smartphone. And then you have the majority of the world which operates online using Facebook on a different type of phone. So it's on lo-fi. They are very smart about where they go to and what uses the data that they've got access to. And they use that to be very powerful aspects of their life. And they'll often do it on behalf of others. So a lot of the feedback that we see coming into Loop is people feeding back on behalf of 60 other people, so representing other groups. And the other area is the anonymity that the technology brings, that you can't get doing something face to face, which we're seeing as sort of opening up a whole range of other activities and services that can be provided through technology. So I really do think, I mean, our moderators in all primarily use their phone. They don't have laptops. They're not sort of browsing the internet, as you're saying. It's all lo-fi. It's all on the phone. Everything has to be accessible through in that way. So it's really a very, very different use of technology than what we're used to, which sort of closes the circle back around
Yeah.
making sure that we're talking to them and designing services for them.
And I ask a
So
question for you.
mobile. Mhm.
How do you um, stop nefarious means for the technology? So let's say you're in a country where there's political persecution, or where the government have lists of mobile phone numbers, and it's happening in Myanmar, it's happening in Ukraine, etc. How do you try and safeguard the people who have a phone, the phone number's been logged location-wise? In Kenya, you have to give your ID number, for example, to get an M-Pesa account. Even in Spain, if I want to get a train in Spain, I have to show my passport. And obviously in countries where the situation is not ideal, how do you safeguard the safety of the people when they're using a device that's always on, always accessible, always visible?
I find a lot of people who are at risk of these types of persecution are the most informed about how best to safeguard themselves and their access. What we do with Loop is that people can go directly to the website and there's no trace. So it would just show that you've been to talk to Loop, but there'll be no trace on any phone or anything about what you've submitted and how you've submitted it. And you can choose if you leave behind your phone number or your email, or you choose not to at all.
Mhm.
Or if you use somebody else's phone, they won't be able to see what you've submitted. There are some apps which are sort of have got specific securities around them for that specific country, which is human rights groups have sort of specific knowledge about them, and they keep them quite secret so that not everybody can sort of try to access it. But yeah, once again, I think it's quite different in every context depending on what the specific risks are and how the government or whoever it is that's persecuting or what technologies they're using to access those people.
Have you ever thought, Alex, about having a very low technology VPN solution for Nokia phones, etc.? The ability to have a proxy, for example. So if I'm in northern Ethiopia, where there's persecution, for whatever tribe you're from, etc., to provide a very low tech solution where you can perhaps mask your location.
Yeah, so would be called tunneling, isn't it? I'm not a technologist. I'm a humanitarian, but I understand that. Is that tunneling?
Yeah. VPN tunneling is ability. Let's say, for example, I want to not be seen from visiting a site from Spain. I can pretend I'm visiting a site from Albania, or for a bad example, or America or the UK, for example. But for example, the government, any telco in a country, in Ethiopia, in Kenya, in Afghanistan, every message I send via the telco, they can read that message. WhatsApp, for example, prime example in UAE and Dubai, trying to get access to WhatsApp. WhatsApp got in trouble last year. The fact that they were openly admitting that they were giving the data away. So if I'm trying to send a message to Ethiopia or wherever else, the government can't. They can see that message definitely.
Yeah, and the same with aggregators, the more different third parties that you're using, that the message is going through, which is why if people are submitting a sensitive story or something of that nature, then it's always best to do it directly to the provider. So on Talk to Loop or whoever it is, it might be a trafficking support center in Ukraine or Poland or somewhere like that, or but yeah, then again that requires internet connectivity. So anything on a phone, SMS, a call, you don't have those capabilities, do you?
It's a good part of the conversation, because as we switch to digital, you also have to kind of update your knowledge on what are the options in terms of security. Some people are, and they will figure out ways to make it secure, but some people won't use those tools because they rightfully worried about things. And the situation changes. For example, right now in Ukraine, as Russia is progressing, they're putting Ukrainians in a Russian internet, in a Russian network. So suddenly you could have people that just don't have the literacy of those security elements because they never specifically had to worry about it, suddenly being like, oh, I have to get knowledgeable. And for some people, they will just stop using it and they'll revert back to other ways.
It is. It's a fear technology. Let's say my grandmother, for example, she can send an SMS, for example, right? Doesn't understand technology at all, and all of a sudden it's the devil. It's a magic tool that can help you do some things, but there's a certain fear towards it, a bit like ATMs. And so we discussed before around why do we use mobile money? Because it's an easy to use tool. Some of the best days I've seen is people in Malawi who had a bank card, the first bank card in their entire life. For them it was a day they became a real person. For them it was a day they became part of society, and that's what microfinance brings towards them: ability to go into the bank, put your card in towards that. But there was a lot of fear towards, what is this machine that I put my thing into and spits out money? And so it's an education piece, in a lot of ways, but not trying to overly complicate things, towards, providing them with browser access, or providing them with trying to describe about here are the potential security concerns about using your phone. At that point, they'd walk away in seconds.
And there's also the accessibility element. So internet is getting cheaper by the day. Sadly, not quick enough in Canada, in North America. When I travel in Europe, I regret instantly the money I pay for basically a monthly fee here for just a cell phone. I think in Europe I can have a whole buffet of all the services of like internet, phone at home as well. The cost is different.
In developing countries, I always say the fastest internet in the world I've seen is in Myanmar, is in Kenya, It's the cheapest internet in the world.
Yeah.
I buy 2 gig of data. It costs me half a dollar.
Yeah, and
And
this is where I was going towards actually. It's fantastic example to keep that when people make their decisions about how to make accessible their educational program, their when they plan the impact that they want to have and etc. Account for the fact that internet is getting cheaper by the day, and in many areas, as you mentioned, Paul, it's already incredibly cheap. Now you have to put things in scale. It's cheap compared to us. It's not always cheap compared to for the local population. You have areas, for example, in Africa where a gigabyte of internet can cost the equivalent of a few weeks of work, right? And this is basically when you put back in scale. And the trends we see is when we talk about 5G, is 5G has, let's say when we move from 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G, is the range of each antenna is smaller and smaller. So we're going towards more towards faster network, but less range,
It's,
right?
it's it's fascinating though. So why does a person in Laos or Cambodia need 5G? They don't. My brother lived in Myanmar for 10 years, and so Myanmar went from under the junta in 2013 to having no internet. Within 4 years, they had a coverage of 94% of the entire country within
Mhm.
4 years by mobile phones. Do they care if it's 2G, 3G, 4G? No, not in the slightest.
Yeah.
It's a certain Western thing about can I download my something faster? Can I access it, etc.
Mhm.
As Alex and I have been talking many years about USSD, etc. The more advanced functions perhaps are just not a requirement. More core basic human needs can be provided by phones and phone networks.
What we see though is, and I was recently in Morocco, and I was talking. We're invited in the Morocco Telecom that actually has a huge. They basically purchased a lot of the cell phone companies across, specifically the northern and west side of Africa. And when we talked about the coverage, let's say even just in Morocco, they said, "Oh, we have this coverage of about more than 90%." But at the same time, I was working with an organization that works in those douars, those villages in Morocco, and they're like, yes, but we don't see it where we are. And the difference of that connectivity also deals with rural areas. I was looking at the stats recently, and in about half of the world did not connect to internet in the last 3 months.
Yeah.
Part of it deals with issues of accessibility, as Alex mentioned, in terms of if you're familiar to even use it, right? But also in some areas you just do not have the connection physically, and that's still way more than anyone assumes. And to give an example, a counter example, in Canada, if we look at rural populations, not rural areas, because most of Canada is a rural area really, but rural populations, half of them still don't have access to basic internet speed. And what it often comes to is when we start defining, well, what is internet? It often comes with this idea, okay, it has to be unlimited, and it has to be at a minimum speed where you can, for example, do a video call. Often that's kind of the definition that starts to stall, because if I have access to internet, but it's crazy expensive and very slow, well, you don't put all the eggs in the same basket. In Canada, we have 98% coverage with cell phone connection, but I'm not going to watch a class on my cell phone connection, right? And many students are currently struggling with COVID in that situation where they basically do not have a good landline that even fits basic requirements, very comparable to something they had 10 years ago. The cell phone is super fast. As we talked, the technology got good, the network is good, but it's not unlimited. So it cuts you from a lot of the usage as well.
Interesting.
Alex, you wanted to add? Yeah.
Yeah, just that Boris had Elon Musk over asking him to get Starlink to get more access to people within the United Kingdom. So
It's still
I think
expensive. It's those things are $100, and when
I
I look at
actually,
the projection, it's still going to be
I
expensive.
actually have a Starlink here. Not because I don't have internet. I've got fiber to the house. I'm just a bit of a geek curious, and it's not cheap, but he will, in my view,
yeah,
change the world.
Mhm.
monopolize.
I was in Africa when Google Loon were trying to do their balloons.
Yeah.
I in Congo, in Kinshasa, I was paying $6,900 a month for a VSAT satellite connection
Mhm.
for between 256 to 512 kilobytes. So
So I'm curious about that. What's your projection in terms of because for example, Starlinks. We forget there's also another initiative, and I think a third one
Yeah,
on the way. What is the kind of map where it will become accessible for, let's say, let's not go in for individuals yet, but let's say organizations, let's say NGOs that are doing field work. By when will it start being even accessible for them?
I think it's here now. I think it's pipped to be about 36,000 satellites. A bit of a amateur astrophotographer myself, and so it is pollution of the skies. But the latency, the cost, from $7,000 a month towards probably about $400 a month plus some capex on the devices. He, like it or not, he has lucked upon or thought upon a very good idea. He spent in excess of $140 million now sending up satellites, so rockets towards that, and that will only increase. There's also one link. One link is another competitor towards that. But for me, it's the future. Having lived and breathed in many remote areas, the ability to put a satellite up, latency to have that bandwidth towards that is the future.
Yeah, I agree completely, and I think the governments will start supporting it. And if the business in each country being able to get the whole population online and to learn online, to exchange online, to become part of the business, to be part of the workforce, to be part of the democratization of decision making and information sharing, etc. I mean, that's only going to be to the benefit of the governments, and I think that some countries will also be leapfrogging, internet access. It'll all be through these satellite, I think, in the future. I don't know how long it will take. I'm not a technologist. I keep declaring this, feeling a little bit, but I think it's the future. I mean, imagine how much business is done online already, and therefore the potential capture of the market that you can have by monopolizing that sector is just enormous.
I've been looking at the technology. My general feeling is that we're still talking about like a 10-year horizon, and there's a physical limit of how many satellites you can put. We forget, but you also need a lot of ground stations. So for example, I don't remember the exact numbers, but basically Elon Musk populated Canada with those ground stations that physically has to be there and also connected to electrical grid and etc. You need them for every few satellites. Actually, it's not a small number. It's a significant deployment on the ground to be able to connect those satellites, because as they move, they need to be connected physically so they can pass the message to each other. So currently it's very expensive, and I think it will still stay expensive for a long time, because having the low latencies. So what we mean, for those who are not familiar with low latency, is basically it's not the speed. Let's say you click and you start a HD video. The latency is what's the delay between the moment you click and the video starts appearing. Let's say the first picture. That is the latency, and that will become a very interesting currency for a lot of people that do need very fast latency for their connections. But if the connection right now, it's still $100 a month, and the device costs $600, and you need a perfect line of sight, and it's an expensive device to leave outdoor that somebody can steal, because again, $600 that you put on a roof, that's something. Unless those costs dramatically goes down, it will still be difficult to deploy.
Yeah, I agree and don't agree. I mentioned before about Congo and the $6,000 a month for a very small connections, etc. And again, people, they don't do video calls. That's not what they do. For them, can I transfer data? Can I find out the market price of wheat in the next sort of time? So I'm a very anti-video call person, as you guess for tonight, not for my own fault. But
sorry, Paul, we didn't want to rub you the wrong way.
COVID times has accelerated this, and people, they want to connect. If they can connect and touch someone or send a message, that's fantastic. Video calls is a very new thing. I had my first video phone in 1996, and it took until COVID before video phones took off. And why is that? People wanted to connect. They were at home, they were self-isolating, etc. And so really, for Cisco, who are now kicking himself in the foot, for Zoom, etc., video calls have been around for 25 years, 30 years, and only in the last 2 years the video calls taken off. And it's the least of the functionality that people require from a social impact perspective. They just want to be
Hmm.
connected at a cheap price. A video call would be uh, a nice to have.
So, as you mentioned, one scenario I could see easily for organization is they themselves, for example, get something like a satellite connection with something like Starlink in order to create a Wi-Fi network that could then feed an entire school. And suddenly, so not every individual, but you could
Yeah,
have in rural areas some access points, let's say where you have the farmer market or etc., where during some
which they
periods
have already.
everybody could have
They,
access.
they, they do. They have rugged, dust resistant devices that you could have a
Oh yeah.
device that may have a decent connection towards a nearest base station, etc. And then it becomes a revenue generating for the co-op, for the
Yep.
village. The fact that you can
Absolutely.
you can pay a subscription for that. So yeah, it's a huge challenge. It really is. Working in austere environments, working in environments where there's weather difficulties, where there's dust, there's theft, etc. To find a device that actually works. And again, for 3D printing, for example, I always had the idea to put 3D printers in villages in Sudan, etc. They didn't last very long, shall I say.
Mm,
Harvested for parts. It's like the UN giving a tractor to someone in Somalia.
Uh,
It's fine for 2 years until it breaks down, or giving mosquito nets. And so, to understand, as Alex does, the cultural nuances about how the technology impacts people within there, and to try and fit that towards them.
mm.
it's true. And again, if you don't
That's,
have electricity, or if your electricity spikes up, I've seen a lot of computer in schools do educational work that basically just died because of power fluctuation, and electricity will just keep shutting down, and ultimately it'll start affecting hardware. And basically, the stuff that works in a perfect grid
mm,
in terms of electricity or in terms of internet, you need to make sure that when you deploy it in remote locations, you're not dependent. It's not as rare to have internet as it used to be, but you need to make sure that if electricity shuts down or internet shuts down, suddenly it doesn't block your experience. A case I've seen is if you're a teacher and you're about to give a workshop and you have internet only half of the time, what are you gonna do like you don't have internet? You don't want to get caught
mm,
handed, so you're going to say, you know what, I'm going to use the good old board because that works 100% of the time. So you have this kind of critical reliability in terms of technologies, and if you as an organization wants to use those technology, you better make sure that if internet slows down or is not accessible or electricity cuts, you can still do it, right? Sorry, Alex, go ahead.
No, definitely. And so all of a sudden, you have to have the infrastructure for power systems, power supplies for back-to-back generators, for diesel generators, and so forth. So really, even in major cosmopolitan areas in developing countries, the power is out every few hours. And so, I've lost a lot of devices over the years because of power surge, etc. So it is a problem. It's a huge problem, and forget teaching in the schools, but if you're trying to run a machine for dialysis in a hospital, relying on the electricity system, etc., and then trying to make that device smart, for example. So all of a sudden, the internet becomes a crucial part of that device operating. To understand if that link, and it will go out, how do you still
mm.
operate?
And do you have a solution for that with your 3D printing, Paul?
Absolutely not. No, no, not at all. I think towards that, it's about reliance on solar power, which is cheaper, better, faster. But it all comes back towards generators for diesel. Towards if you have critical systems, how do you keep operating? It's a challenging situation because the national power grids are run badly. The national power grids have frequent outages due to poor maintenance, and now especially with the gas and oil problem across the globe. To understand, look at Sri Lanka. How do you operate a country when you have no gas and oil coming in?
But it's an interesting element, right? If you deploy, again, technologies, tools, it could be as simple as you have a way to purify water, etc. You're setting up infrastructures and etc. Things like 3D printing, or make sure that you work in open source environments where people will be able to service and uh, repair the infrastructure that you're putting in place. I think we start talking more and more about that. We've seen too many projects dying after a few years and just nobody being even able to maintain it because those parts are absolutely not accessible. And having things like 3D printing could be something that organization add to their stack, saying if we deploy this type of pumps for water, we'll also kind of have a catalog of parts that anybody can order, for example.
I think so. 3D printing from a low cost and desktop perspective has a 10 years at least before it gets to that point. I run a business with 3D printing. We have a probably 80% success rate, and so it's not foolproof yet. Amazon tried to have you can 3D print your kid's part in a shop, etc., but it's not affordable. So there's still 10 years to go before I just press a button and out pops a dinosaur or out pops a water pipe. It's very fickle. It's very susceptible towards conditions for dust, for heat, for conditions, and so yeah. From my perspective, 10 years. I thought 10 years ago that 3D printing would be mainstream. I thought my dad would be 3D printing a soap dish in his house. It's not happened. And the reason it's not happened is towards a global monopoly of the large corporates in the 3D printing world who have kept the prices high, material, machines, and not made them robust enough to survive in conditions that are outside of a Canadian household, for example.
So, what do you think of those fab labs, for example, that are popping up? I'm sure there's a lot. That phenomenon is as present in England and everywhere else of kind of using the almost kind of a methodologies of fab labs and start instructing kids on the fact that they can also build things, not just code things. There's a lot of movement of teaching coding to kids too, and the fab labs is kind of the hardware side of, let's say, that. Do you think it's basically setting that kind of layer that in 10 years when those technologies will become very affordable and cheap, you'll have people that will be literate in terms of knowing that they can build things, not just consume them?
Yes, I think the Fab Lab concept has largely failed, if I'm being very frank, across the world, in terms of its upskilling local populations. We have some fantastic young engineers all across the world who are becoming engineers, upskilling. The technology lets them down, and one of the problems is scale and volume. It still takes me 2 days to print a water pipe, for example. So if I need to send 1,000 water pipes out, very similar towards what happened with COVID and PPE. So the whole world of 3D printing thought they could start printing masks, they start printing O2 splitters, etc., and didn't quite understand that a tinkerer in his garage is not adhering towards regulations. So if I'm doing, for example, a splitter for O2 to help have two ventilators, that device that's been made by a global corporate has been tested to death. It's oxygen, it can go on fire, it's limited retardant. And so for COVID and PPE, it actually took the world of 3D printing back about 5 years, I would say, because of the fact that they soon realized that I needed to make 1 million masks. A 3D printer could make 100 a week.
But there's a case to be said that's for volume, but any parts, like any parts for, let's say, a car, you just need to repair a Jeep, for example. Any parts in as soon as you get in rural areas, especially in, let's say, in a small village in Morocco, or I remember I had discussion with people in Tunisia, like all the parts suddenly cost the double or the triple.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not even an issue of volume. Volume being just having the capacity of buying on that volume is one thing. But even if you just need one or two, you're just not able because it's either too expensive to buy,
Yeah.
and it just nobody will sell you for such a small volume. So maybe in those cases, if you don't need to repair 1,000 pipes, but maybe just one or two, 3D printing can still work if the alternative is waiting a month for it to be shipped at 3 times the cost.
Correct, but it will last for a month. The materials, for the normal polylactic acid, which is the main material used in FDM printing, it's got an absorption rate of 3% with moisture. So my example was I made prosthetic hands in Myanmar, and we put the hand into a bucket of paddy water. After a month, there was no hand left.
Oh yeah. Okay, you made your case, Paul. It's
Yeah.
so I'm wrapping up because the time flies by. So we talked about making financial transactions. We talked about how phones are getting better and more accessible, how accessibility tools are, you can use text to speech with, let's face it, it gets better by the day. It makes me think of that. There was an experiment that was done where they put a tablet I think in a village a computer in the village in India, and suddenly everybody was speaking with a good British accent. And the reason is because the text to speech was set up to optimize around that. It's comical, but it does have consequences. We talked about 3D printing. We talked about security as well, that comes with issues when people are connected. They're doing telecommunication, but in countries where security, you cannot necessarily trust the official instances, right? So suddenly those solutions could also be significant problems. And we talked about cases like Ukraine, where people don't necessarily have the reflexes related to those security elements, and suddenly are confronted with changing dynamics. And we have a bit of time, I think, for maybe the most important part of that is also, now that you have all those tools, all those options, all those risks, something that's really important, I think, in nonprofits as we're going towards it, is to have more transparency. If you are planning the next 5 years, technology is one element you have to account for, as Alex put it so well, accessibility issues in general, because it does allow access to interesting resources if you make that tool accessible as well. But also, as a nonprofit, you have to be very thoughtful about security component and the decision making process that goes into your own organization. Those are public organizations often, even. So they have to be transparent about how they make decisions. And again, technology could be an interesting use here. We want to use technology to make government transparent. How about using technology to make social impact organizations more transparent? Alex, I see you smile. I see you nodding aggressively, controlling yourself. What
I'm
do you
too
have in
sure.
mind?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's just what Leaf is all about. So that's exactly what we're focusing on and working on all the time, is how can people democratize their opinions, their experiences, their priorities, what's important to them during a crisis, whether that's sudden onset, floods, droughts, fires like we're seeing at the moment, but it could also be during election period when they want to raise their voices in a safe way. And then people who are there to serve them, there to help them, social impact organisations, can take that information openly. We all have this access to the same information, and adjust our programs and our activities based on what local people are saying, rather than necessarily what donors are saying or where funding's coming from. So for an example of what we've experienced is in the Philippines, directly after Typhoon Odette at the beginning of the year, immediate need, obviously get people to safety. It was first aid. Very, very quickly people wanted to get their houses back up so that they would be protected from future weather. And then very quickly after that, their needs turned to what we saw coming through on LEAP was the needs turned to electricity and lighting to keep safe, and then to be able to continue working during the evening hours. And that was through solar power. So then we saw people using that data, getting funding and delivering what those people had asked for. It's the same with the Ukraine crisis. We're seeing that initially the first surge was about information. Where can I go to? How can I get safe? What about visas, etc.? And now it's much more complex questions coming through about usually people who were the least able to leave. Maybe they didn't have family or friends or resources outside of Ukraine, so they're coming across with much less language skills. And so learning from what do people actually need, and if we're social impact organisations, we should be responding to what are the social needs that people are saying are their priorities. And I think that this open data, learning from each other about what's working and what's not working, you have collective networks that are working on mapping and sharing of information. I just think it's the future. It's really about democratizing information, democratizing accountability, opening up decision making and power to more people to have greater accountability. I was smiling because that's the core of what I do every day.
Alex, a quick question for you, Alex. technology crystal ball.
Mm,
So from my view, let's say I'm going to go quite far ahead here, Valentin,
mm,
towards let's say 15 years, right? Towards what does a mobile phone look like in 15 years? What does a technology device look like in 15 years? For me, it's an implant in your arm, right? I think it's that Minority Report, towards the fact that it's a wearable device that's actually in your body, towards that sort of thing. And I think actually that will translate quite quickly towards the lack of ethics and governance in developing countries, in that people will move towards that. Alex, where do you see our loop within 10, 15 years? What technology do you think will be there towards enhancing what you provide?
So I think it'll all be voice. I don't think there'll be any written. You'll be hearing it and you'll be speaking it in your own language. So I'll be speaking to you in English, and you'll be, if you're in Spain, speaking to me in Spanish, and I'll be hearing English and you'll be hearing Spanish from me. And it'll be much more visual, and it'll be real time, and people will expect to be able to feedback. People would be expect to see what other people are saying. So I think the demand side will be quite different as well. And I think that the technology, so the access to the internet and the use of these, I don't think it'll be in the arm. Maybe it will be. I do think that there's two realities about online. One is those people who have access to 5G and funds, etc. And there's others which will still be a device that will definitely be internet enabled in 15 years. All of them, I think. And yeah, I think it'll be primarily voice. I mean, if I look at my 13-year-old daughter, everything's in voice for her.
It's so funny. I
Yeah,
don't use voice at all, Alex. I don't
yeah,
use Google Assistant. I don't use all that sort of thing. I'm a more old. I think the older you get, the more old school you become towards how I use technology. I have a non-smartphone basically. It's
yeah.
interesting.
Well, sorry if I can, Valentine. So my 13-year-old, she'll ask the phone a question. She will get the reply back and have it spoken to her instead of reading it. She will take text and put it into Google Translate and have Google Translate read it to her. But then when you're talking about populations around the world, the majority of the world doesn't speak English, and massive population doesn't feel confident speaking, communicating through the written word, and a lot of the languages that people do feel comfortable writing, speaking in, are not accessible on digital technology.
Mhm.
So accessibility can be massively enabled by using voice
I think
across languages.
translation is a core element
Yeah.
because a lot of the mapping we make on internet, we at Greybox we often download Wikipedia, for example, for projects. And the first time I downloaded Wikipedia in French, I thought there was for a project in Africa. I thought there was a problem with my connection and that it dropped because it took me surprisingly little amount to download because a few weeks before I downloaded the English database, and it's more than it's three times
Yeah,
smaller, a bit less than
exactly.
that. You go from 6 million articles to 2 million articles, and not as well written as well. So there's a huge difference of in your language. What resources can you access?
Yeah.
And Paul, I'm a bit more confident. I do understand the appeal of writing because when you scan data, but not everybody is comfortable. I've seen recently Slack playing with a feature that I found could reconcile me with using voice for work, which is I could say a message or somebody can send me a message, voice, but it will also
Mm,
transcribe.
Yeah.
mm,
So based
mm.
on the context, one makes more sense than others.
But
I've
that's
been in
just our
cases where I want to hear
generation.
you, and I'm in the context where I want to scan your thoughts real
But
quick.
that's just to help us cross generations, They're
Yeah,
the non-digital natives. Once we're
but
out of the way, they won't need that anymore.
I see it where because the friction point becomes so low,
Mm,
there are cases where I cannot use audio.
mm,
I mean, and there are
of
cases
course.
where text makes more sense because it's more precise. And there's cases where voice gives me information that I
Absolutely.
cannot have. And if you can make those layers coexist together, why not? Actually, right? I wouldn't
It's
be
fu-
surprised.
I
Mhm.
agree. So I was saying before, I don't use speak to text on my phone or my computer, but I do have Alexas in my entire house,
Mm,
right? And so
Aha.
wow.
I find them amazing. But I was thinking before, Alex, about in Kenya there's 43 languages, so
Mm,
Swahili is the most prevalent. How do you deal with a rural person that speaks the language blah?
mm,
Towards the nuances in languages in Nigeria and Somalia,
yeah,
etc. All of a sudden, that's an awful lot of
yeah,
AI machine learning to
yeah.
deal with that.
I agree completely, and that's why we said 15 years and not
Yeah.
5 or
There's
absolutely.
projects.
But
Yeah.
but that will only happen when there's a financial benefit for it for somebody.
The field of AI is interesting. I've been looking at translation efforts for Wikipedia. We have one at Greybox to using ML models. So we kind of did a mapping of all the ML models for translation and how much do they need as a reference,
Mm,
a table to kind of make those conversions. And it gets better. There's an incredible amount of open source
mhm.
from university development,
Projects.
because something really interesting happened now is if they fund projects, they ask you to be published in an open access, right? It's a significant shift. And I think it's interesting if you start doing projections over where those technologies are going to keep an eye. Recently, Facebook released, worked on a new model that can translate in even lesser represented languages.
Yeah.
And the first thing I looked at is this model open source? And it is.
Mm,
So suddenly you
absolutely.
have interesting models that appears that require less and less knowledge,
Mm,
opening the gates for less and less common languages
yeah.
to be interfacing in terms of translation, in terms of
Yeah.
voice, and all of that. That is happening. And if one thing we know is with AI, it's happening pretty fast.
It'll go.
It is, but my example again towards, so I use Alexa to open my blinds, to the news, etc. I don't ever use voice on my phone or my laptop, for example.
Mhm.
Perhaps it's a sort of generational thing. COVID
Mm,
has accelerated video phone calling. It's been around for 20, 30 years, and now video phone calling is here to stay. It's now cemented.
Mhm. Mhm.
What will cement voice to text on a laptop, on a phone? It's not there yet. Towards I still type, I still touch screen, etc. I feel as though there's still 5 to 10 years away before laptops from Dragon Speak from IBM back in the day can truly understand my Scottish accent
yeah.
and give me, the appropriate
Now
commands
we
that I
know
want.
why. Now we know how Paul got hurt. The Scottish accent. But it's true. Everybody has very various accents, and those models are not always picking it up.
And
Alex?
not yet. We're not yet.
Okay.
We're talking about the future, aren't we? We're not the short
Yeah.
future, the distant future. But yeah.
And he deals with options. We talked early on about connectivity. And
Mm,
one case I've seen is more and more cell phone carriers, for example, offer
mm,
WhatsApp for free.
mm,
Literally, unlimited buffet of WhatsApp. And
Yeah.
what I've seen is and by the way, if you're an organization, consider this because it's fantastic, is more and more organizations. So one interesting strategy is when a cell phone carrier in remote areas is offering WhatsApp for free, that's getting more and
Yep.
more popular, is that I
yeah.
start seeing educational programs, training about sexual education, about various technical skills, and etc., happening in this micro format that is
Yep.
unaccessible, video,
Yeah.
unlimited. And then when I was talking about that with some teachers in Canada, they're like, "Why would you watch a whole class on the phone?" And I was like, first of all, if you don't have any other option, this is a fantastic option. And two, it fits with how people are using their technology. They're on a go. They need a mobile, a micro kind of bit of knowledge that they can digest quickly to help them fix a very concrete problem. They don't have time to do a 3-year undergrad
But
study, right?
there is a but here. So I looked into Google for Business, for example, recently for my clients, for them to contact me via WhatsApp, to ask questions, so forth. I worked out it would cost me between £20 to £30 for a 40 conversation. So WhatsApp for Business is very smart. And it's not to say, within the setting you just mentioned, Valentin, in Africa example, WhatsApp take the pound of flesh. They certainly will charge you for
Mm-hmm.
the development of its applications. It's not
Mm-hmm.
for free, And so I find this
Interesting.
model quite interesting, a bit like Netflix starting to charge for adverts. That WhatsApp has spent 15 years making zero profit, and now it's their time. So
It's
they
interesting.
are they
Makes
are
sense.
charging
Makes sense.
through the hilt now. Literally, I've been quoted hundreds of thousands of dollars for developing the applications in WhatsApp,
Oh
and
wow.
a conversation that would have cost me zero on the phone would now cost me $40. over
Oh wow.
WhatsApp. So,
Okay,
yeah, so
that's definitely interesting.
yeah, yeah.
One
It's
case, and I just want to close with that, and that'll probably make a whole new show in itself in terms of data. When I was in Poland, I was studying the kind of data fluxes that goes related to the Ukrainian conflict. For those who are not familiar, there's a fantastic site named Relief Web. That's pushed by UN. Fantastic source that just got better over time, which is rare for things like that. And they start pulling more and more data over the years from a project called HDX. And HDX is basically a fantastic way of mapping, for example, in the context of Ukraine, to give this very simple example, where are people coming and going? What are the conflict pinpoint in the map? And all of this is so easy to interface for organizations, where literally everything they have on the website, you can point, they can say how often this data source is updated. And when you click on that data source, it's just a Google Sheet. So a Google Sheet can be used for all kind of other data. And for me, it's just, yes, have those information from the on the ground from your people in the field, but also as an organization in the next 5 years, keep an eye on official sources like HDX that just are more easy to digest now, where you could actually see, oh, there's a flux of immigrant between this border. This is where we need to move because we have this data. And that means that as an organization, you also have, when you produce data, reshare with organization like HDX. They made it ridiculously simple that you can share your data. And when we talked about transparency, we didn't have enough time, I think, to discuss the matter. Pulling from up-to-date data and reshare the data that the organization creates in a transparent way will help us having more impact, or at least even measure the impact we have, so we can kind of compare things and prioritize and deprioritize and etc. Hey, it's going fast, I know. I told you 1 hour is cruel, but essentially, thank you so much, Alex, for your time. You provide a fantastic perspective. One quick, if you have 30 seconds to close, do you have any current project that you want to shout at the community to, if they want to know more about what you do?
We're always about the same thing, about accountability and listening to local people and acting as a result of what they're saying as their priorities. So talktoloop.org. You can see what people are saying in Ukraine and Poland, the Philippines at the moment. There's work on Ebola, Zambia, Indonesia, and Somalia.
Fantastic. Take a look on the website, folks. It's actually pretty well done. You get a very unique outtake, and I think with the rest of the conversation you will see why we went into those direction and how that impacts people living in those areas. And Paul, what are you working on, where people can find more about you?
Yeah, so I went from a social enterprise towards a commercial organization. My heart is still firmly humanitarian, and so I won't discuss about the commercial side. It pays the bills and so
It
forth.
was a good
But
perspective. It was good.
yeah, I was a banker before and moved towards this world, which is a lot more fulfilling. But what we're most proud of, we do a lot of work with humanitarian towards the provision of fake landmines and rockets towards helping educate those less fortunate. So, example, we just recently sent a whole bunch of boxes to Ukraine to teach children, to teach people, this is a shiny thing, it's bad for you, it will kill you. And also recently, we do a lot of work with a company called the David Knott Foundation. It's the most fantastic organization in the UK. David Knott himself is the founder. He's a war surgeon and regularly goes to Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine, etc., and teaches the local surgeons how to deal with war wounds. And so we're very proud as an organization with 3 Life Prints to provide them with very high fidelity models of kidneys, of hearts, of livers, etc., to help the surgeons locally understand how to deal with a gunshot, with a traumatic wound, with a bomb blast, etc. And really, for me, this is how we start as an organization, and this is what makes me happy. Towards the fact that we're making a difference within countries that are just having a horrendous time, like Ukraine. And with Valentin, what he's doing with his organization is fantastic. And so, really, it's nice to provide a service that actually gives back.
Fantastic.
Can I add
Thank
on
you,
to
Paul.
that for Paul?
Go ahead.
He's building beating hearts. He was telling me the other day.
Beating
Yeah,
hats.
it's actually a very interesting segue towards that. So, in the Western world, if you have a problem with your heart, they stop your heart. They have ability to stop your heart and use various fluids and so forth to keep you alive. If you're in a war zone, for example, there's no facilities to stop your
Yeah.
heart if you've been shot in the heart. So we developed a solution with the David Dock Foundation. I would certainly encourage all of you to go and look at the website, look at the wonderful work they do. Ability for a simulated heart that looks like a heart, it beats like a heart, it sleeps like a heart, for them to practice doing surgery on while it's
Yeah.
beating. And for us, we're very proud of what we did with that, and we hope it's helping lives.
Fantastic. Hey, thank you, everyone. We went 9 minutes over, which is in the scope of a 1 hour podcast. Is moderately okay, but I don't want to take more of your time. Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you, Paul. We're going to clip this conversation into smaller chunks as well, based on the various topics we covered. I want to thank you all for this, and see you next time, maybe for one of the other topics we didn't have time to cover. There's a lot
Definitely.
to say. Thank you again.
Thanks, Valentine. Thanks for your time.
Super. Thank you much.
Bye.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Fantastic. And for you viewers, don't go. You still can share, comment, like, subscribe. You know the whole spiel. But essentially, what's coming up? We have a lot of topics we want to cover. To give you an example, even for this episodes, I will say from the long term tech trends. Oh gosh, we covered like not even a third of the things we wanted to talk. It's definitely a complex and interesting field. But we have more podcasts coming up. The format is a monthly one. I'll probably do the next one in Georgia, not the state, the country. But essentially, we have things related to transparency and governance. You've seen Alex hinting a bit about that topic as well. We have things coming up about the social impact in the world of tech. So current startups do they integrate interesting models or thinking related to their social impact as well. We'll have all kind of topics related to be more efficient as an organization to have more impact. So if you're interested, stay tuned, share the show, and see you next time.